Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the tragic story of Thomas Hogan and the murder of Jane Hogan, which took place in Gateshead in 1888. I hope you will find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money at all, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. This is sadly one of those stories where there is little to no information about the past lives of those involved, so the backstory will be quite basic. Thomas Hogan was born in around 1851 in Newcastle, and his parents are unknown. He was a furnace man but had lately been working as a labourer, but no job location for him is mentioned. He lived with Jane in Church Walk in Gateshead. Jane Hogan, the victim, was said to be around 41 years old at the time of her death, so would have been born in around 1847. She had also been born in Newcastle, and her parents are also unknown. She had previously been married and had at least one child with her first husband. It is not clear if she was married to Thomas or not. She did use his name, and it was stated in the census that she was his wife, and it was thought that they had married several years earlier from 1888, but some reports suggest she was actually still legally married to her first husband. And although it is not mentioned by many people at the inquest or the trial, it would seem that Jane was known to be a heavy drinker. On the afternoon of April the 22nd, 1888, in Church Walk in Gateshead, an argument was heard coming from the stairs near to the rooms of Thomas and Jane Hogan. Neighbours heard the couple shouting at each other, and then Jane was heard to fall down the stairs, hitting her head on the way down. A policeman who had been near the area at the time was soon on the scene and found Jane at the bottom of the stairs, almost unconscious and bleeding badly. With help, he carried her into the rooms of a lady by the name of Mrs. Henderson, who lived on the ground floor of the same building. He then went upstairs and arrested Thomas on a charge of ill-using Jane Hogan. A doctor was sent for, and on examining Jane, he found her to be in a very serious condition. There was nothing he could do for her, believing that she had a fractured skull. He returned to see her again later that night, and by then she was much worse, and Jane Hogan died at around 1 a.m. on the morning of April the 23rd. Thomas Hogan, who was still in custody at the police station, was then charged with her willful murder, to which he replied, "I never touched her." The inquest was opened at Gateshead Police Courts before Coroner Graham. Sarah Charlton said she had identified the body as being that of her sister Jane Hogan. She stated that Jane had been married to a man by the name of MacNeil, who she believed lived in Glasgow. She said Jane had not lived with him for several years and had married Thomas at the register office in Pilgrim Street in Newcastle some 9 or 10 years ago. She did not mention if the couple had any children together. James MacNeil, who was 14 years old, said he lived with his mother and Thomas Hogan in Gateshead. He said he'd been in the house with them both on the morning of April the 22nd. He said Thomas's aunt, Mary Johnson, had also been in the house with them. He said Thomas had gone out at around 12 o'clock, and after this, he said his mother and Mary had been drinking. His mother had gone out several times to fill her stone bottle with beer from the local public house, and he had gone to fill it once for her himself. He said the last time that his mother had gone for beer, Thomas had come home, and she'd ran up the stairs to the floor above their rooms and tried to hide the bottle, as she did not want Thomas to see it. He He said Thomas and Jane were outside of the room and he was inside with Mary Johnson. He said he did not hear any argument outside and did not know anything had happened until another of the neighbours called him outside, and he then saw his mother lying at the bottom of the stairs. He did not mention where Thomas was at the time that he was called out to see his mother. Mrs. Catherine Bradley said she also lived in Church Walk in Gateshead. She said she lived on the floor above the Hogans. She said at around 1 p.m. on the afternoon of the 22nd, she saw Jane on the stairs. She said she spoke to her saying, "I would like to have some beer without him," meaning Thomas, knowing. Catherine said that she told her that she could not invite her into her own rooms as her husband would not allow it. Catherine said she did not see her again until just before 3 p.m. She was again outside on the stairs. She said she also saw Thomas, and it looked to her like Jane was trying to run away from him. She said she had her hands above her head, saying, "Oh, Tom, don't," as if she was trying to stop him from hitting her. Catherine said she then saw Thomas lightly slap her around the neck, and after this she thought that he pushed at her with his boot and Jane fell down the stairs. However, Catherine said she could not be sure if Jane had walked towards the stairs or if Thomas had pushed her with his boot, but she had heard her fall. She said she thought Thomas had his boots on at the time, but they were loose as if he was about to take them off. And Catherine also said that Jane seemed very drunk at the time, adding that she was known to drink a lot. She said Thomas went down to the toilet and he didn't seem to notice Jane on the ground at that time, and when he came back up, she said she went down the stairs and went into the Hogan's rooms. She said Thomas was now very distressed. He was saying, "Oh, the foolish woman, why did she not get out of my road?" Catherine said she told him, "See what you have done, you have killed the woman." And she said Thomas told her, "I have found out my mistake now. May the Lord have mercy on me, and may the Lord have mercy on her soul. She was the only friend I had in the world." Christine said he was now crying very much, and she said just a few minutes after this, a policeman came into the room and took Thomas away to the police station. James Curry, who was 15 years old, said on April the 22nd he had been visiting Mrs. Bradley at Church Walk in Gateshead. He said she had sent him outside to the stairs to look for her own daughter, and as he went out onto the landing he saw Thomas and Jane on the floor above. He said Thomas seemed to rush out and kick Jane, and she then fell down the stairs. He said Mrs. Bradley came out and he heard her tell Thomas, "You murdering villain, you have killed your wife." He said Thomas told her, "If I have killed my wife, may the Lord forgive me, may the Lord take her spirit." When asked, he said he did not notice if Thomas had his boots on at the time he had kicked Jane. And at this point, Thomas spoke to James, saying, "I never lifted a hand to her. She had been drinking for a month, and she fell down the stairs herself." John Coombs said he also lived in the same house in Gateshead. He said on the 22nd he heard the couple arguing on the stairs. He had heard them arguing earlier that day as well. And around 2:45 he heard Thomas say, "If you don't go away from here, I will knock your neck out." After this, he said he heard a crashing sound on the stairs. He went out and saw Jane lying at the bottom, and her face was bleeding. He went to find a policeman and found P.C. Moore, who had been on duty close by. When Thomas questioned him, John admitted that he had not seen him touch Jane and did not know for sure how she had fallen down the stairs. William O'Neill said he lived on the ground floor in the house in Gateshead with Mrs. Henderson. He said he was inside on the afternoon of the 22nd and he heard a crash on the stairs, and when he went out he found Jane lying at the bottom and her face was bleeding badly. He said he saw Thomas still standing at the top of the stairs, and he said he heard him swear at Jane and then say, "That serves you well right." P.C. Moore said, acting on information received, he had gone to the house in Church Walk and found Jane Hogan lying at the bottom of the stairs. She was not able to get up, and he said with help he carried her into Mrs. Henderson's house. He then went to look for Thomas, having been told that he had kicked Jane down the stairs. He said he then arrested him for ill-using his wife, and said that on the way to the police station, Thomas had said, "It is a bad job. I have lived with her too long." He did not make any other statements. Thomas had asked for Mary Johnson to give evidence at the inquest, and it was known that she had previously been in the Newcastle workhouse, but she was not currently there, and Detective Jarvis said he had been given an address in Gateshead, and he had visited her and been told by the people living there that Mary had said she was going to Felon, but he had been unable to find her there. No trace of her could be found, and it seems that she was not found for the trial either. Dr. K said he had been called to Church Walk at around 3:30 p.m. on the 22nd. He had found Jane lying on a bed in the downstairs rooms. She was breathing very heavily and blood was flowing from various parts of her face. He said she was very ill. He returned to see her again at around 8 p.m. and she was much worse. Her pulse was very weak and he did not think she would live much longer, and she had died at around 1 a.m. the following morning. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Jane Hogan. He said he found a fracture to the skull and the brain was also damaged near to the fracture, and there was a lot of blood on the brain. He said it was his professional opinion that death had been due to the fracture to the skull and the bleeding on the brain. And he added that she also suffered from what he called rum drinker's liver. He did not discuss how the injury to the skull may have been inflicted. There were no details of the coroner's summing up to the jury, so unfortunately it is impossible to know how he viewed the strange evidence that had been given at the inquest. The jury, however, retired for only a short time, and they returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter under deep provocation. Although it has to be said it is difficult to understand how they came to the provocation part of their verdict based on the evidence given. Thomas Hogan was then committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Jane Hogan. It seems unlikely that the family would have had very much money, so it can be assumed that this may have been a pauper's funeral, and I did not find any evidence of a headstone for Jane anywhere in the area. And sadly, I was also unable to find any details of Jane's son after the 1888 date, but it is to be hoped that he returned to live with his father. At this point, the information of the trial becomes almost impossible to find, with no full details being covered, so sadly the details here will be very basic. The trial itself took place in Durham in July of 1888, although the judge who was presiding over the case was not named. Thomas pleaded not guilty to the charge. And it would seem from the basic evidence reported at the time that Jane was now described as a known heavy drinker. Although only one person really seemed to mention this, however, her own son did state that on the day of her death she had been drinking all afternoon, and it was also suggested that her drinking had caused many arguments between the couple. She was painted as a woman who often caused Thomas great anguish. The prosecution appeared to suggest that after an afternoon of drinking, Thomas had come home to find Jane very drunk. This had caused the couple to argue. Jane, he said, had been standing on the landing outside of their rooms, and Thomas had at first sworn at her, struck her about the face, and then deliberately pushed her down the stairs. The defence appeared to suggest that most of the witnesses had stated that Jane had been drinking all day, some saying that she was in fact very drunk, and that Thomas had simply rushed out of the door of their rooms and pushed her out of his way to get to the stairs himself, and due to her being so drunk, she had lost her balance and had fallen down the stairs, and that the injuries she received that had undoubtedly caused her death had been caused by misadventure. And it seems in this case the jury agreed with the defence, and after only a short retirement they returned a verdict of not guilty, and Thomas was discharged. I did not find any details of Thomas after this date. This was a very, very odd case. It's hard to decide how the jury at the inquest came to their decision of provocation, as the evidence given was very strange. Some saying Thomas had hit and pushed Jane, causing her to fall, others simply stating they had seen nothing and only heard Jane fall. Even Jane's own son said he did not hear any arguments from the couple that day. So, nor did he suggest that the couple had argued on a regular basis, and this suggestion that they did argue often due to Jane's drinking was not mentioned at the inquest. In truth, it feels to me that this is a case that should never have gone past the inquest, as the lack of credible evidence that Thomas pushed Jane makes me surprised that the jury found in favour of manslaughter, let alone with provocation. And this seems to be how the case continued at the trial, although the magistrates would have had to have agreed that to send it to trial, so perhaps they did think there was some evidence, but in the end there was not enough to prove that Thomas had hit and pushed Jane down the stairs. While it was clear that the fall had been the cause of her death, it was not clear if she'd been pushed or if she had fallen. And Thomas also seemed to be very upset by her fall and does not seem to have reacted like a man who had just intentionally pushed a woman down some stairs. However, it was clear that Jane was a heavy drinker, and also that she did seem to be aware that Thomas did not like her to drink as much as she did, as it was heard from one witness that she wanted to drink without Thomas knowing. So, could it be possible that Thomas, finding her drunk once again, had lost his temper and pushed her, causing her to fall? This would make his statement of, "I have found out my mistake now," make more sense, perhaps meaning that he should not have pushed her. But this, it seems, is something we will never know the answer to for certain. And I believe, based on the poor evidence, the lack of proof that Thomas had kicked or pushed her, meant the jury could only really have come to the not guilty verdict. And Thomas, if indeed he did push Jane down the stairs, would have had to live with this for the rest of his life. But what do you think? Do you think Jane was simply so drunk that she lost her balance and fell? Or do you think Thomas, sick of her drunken ways, lost his temper and pushed her? Do you think the jury was right to find him not guilty, or do you think he should have been found guilty of manslaughter? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very strange but also sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.